The story of sexuality through the ages is not simply a tale of pleasure, love, and intimacy. It is also a record of cruelty, coercion, and violence, a reminder that human desire has often been entangled with power and domination. Welcome to our channel, where we explore the hidden sexual practices and dark corners of history that few dare to discuss. Today, we step into the turbulent world of medieval Europe, where the fate of women was frequently shaped by conquest, captivity, and sexual violence. This is not the sanitized Middle Ages of fairy tales or courtly romances, but the harsher, bloodier reality where women's bodies became battlegrounds of control, symbols of honor, and prizes in the endless struggles of men. Imagine a world fractured by war, famine, and shifting borders. Villages burned to the ground, peasants scattered, soldiers marching in and out of ruined fields. In this chaos, women often found themselves at the mercy of men who saw them not as human beings, but as possessions, extensions of male honor or spoils of war. Sexual violence was not a rare deviation, but a recurring shadow, a weapon used to humiliate the defeated and to assert dominance. In chronicles of medieval campaigns, stories of plunder almost always included the ravaging of women. The Viking raids on monasteries and coastal settlements were infamous not only for looting treasure, but for carrying away women who were sold into slavery or forced into concubinage. The Crusades, waged in the name of faith, were punctuated by massacres where women were as vulnerable to the sword as they were to forced violation. One of the cruelest realities of medieval captivity was the blurred line between slavery, ransom, and marriage. A captured woman might be held for ransom, but if her family could not pay, her captors might take her as a wife, concubine, or servant. Consent in such cases was almost unimaginable. Chroniclers wrote of noble women carried off from castles during sieges, becoming trophies for victorious commanders. The fate of the common women, the peasants, rarely found its way into the records. Yet their suffering was likely even greater, and in many ways it was expected. Women were viewed as natural spoils of conquest, as much as cattle or land. In fact, medieval law codes often treated them as property, and the rape of a woman was considered not an offense against her but a crime against her male guardian or husband because it tainted his honor and his lineage. But the horror was not limited to war zones. In everyday life, marriage itself often blurred into a form of captivity. A girl as young as 12 might be given in marriage to a man decades older, her consent irrelevant. For noble women, marriages were political contracts arranged between families, a way to secure alliances and inheritances. Their bodies were vessels for dynastic ambition, their will subsumed under the needs of lineage. Even the church, which claimed to sanctify marriage, demanded obedience and chastity from women while quietly tolerating the abuses of husbands. When manuals instructed priests on hearing confessions, they rarely considered marital rape a sin, because the wife's body was assumed to belong to her husband. The notion of bodily autonomy simply did not exist. Still, scattered throughout the records are the testimonies of resistance. Lawsuits occasionally surface in which women accused men of rape, though the outcomes were rarely in their favor. The burden of proof was crushing. A woman had to show evidence of force, resistance, and public outcry. Silence was taken as consent, and even visible bruises could be dismissed if a man argued that she was his wife or betrothed. And yet women did try. Their voices appear faintly in the margins of legal records, a testament to their struggle to carve out some measure of dignity in a system stacked against them. This is the world we enter in our journey through medieval Europe, a world where sex and violence were inseparable, where captivity defined the lives of countless women, and where the myths of courtly romance hide a much darker reality. And as we continue, we must ask, what did this violence mean for the societies that normalized it? And how did women navigate lives defined by forces they could not control? The deeper we go into the medieval mindset, the more we realize that sexual violence was not always seen through the lens of individual cruelty, but as part of a broader cultural script. A man who violated a woman was often judged not by the harm he caused her, but by the dishonor inflicted on her family. This obsession with honor and purity meant that the woman herself was caught in a cruel paradox. If she was raped, She was seen as dishonored, sometimes even blamed for tempting her attacker. Yet if she spoke out, she risked ruining her family's reputation. In some cases, the solution imposed by communities was that she marry her rapist, thus restoring her honor in the eyes of society. This practice, horrifying to modern sensibilities, was widespread and reinforced the idea that women's lives were less valuable than the preservation of patriarchal control. Religious texts added further layers of complexity. The Church preached virginity as the highest state for women, elevating figures like the Virgin Mary as ideals of chastity. Yet in a violent world, this ideal was almost impossible to uphold. Conquerors who violated women often justified their actions by portraying their victims as sinful or as spoils divinely granted. During the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, chroniclers described not only massacres, but also women seized and forced into submission, framed as part of God's punishment for heresy. The paradox was chilling. Rape could be interpreted as divine justice, absolving perpetrators of guilt and erasing the humanity of victims. Within this system, women were doubly silenced. Not only were their voices rarely recorded, but their very suffering was interpreted through male frameworks of honor, sin, and purity. Yet, cracks in this system sometimes appear. Medieval romances, for instance, often present stories of damsels in distress, abducted and violated, awaiting rescue by a knight. While these tales glamorized violence and reduced women to prizes, they also acknowledged, albeit indirectly, the reality that abduction and assault were constant threats. Behind the myth of the knightly rescuer lies the lived experience of countless women for whom no hero arrived. Captivity also played a central role in the slave trade of the medieval world. We often think of slavery as an early modern phenomenon tied to transatlantic voyages, but medieval Europe had its own networks of human trafficking. Viking raiders captured women in Ireland and England and sold them in the markets of Constantinople. Slavic women were transported across Europe and into the Islamic world, prized for their youth and beauty. Accounts from Arab chroniclers describe northern European women in slave markets, their pale skin and blonde hair exoticized and eroticized. For these women, captivity meant a life where their sexuality was both weaponized and commodified. And yet, even within this grim system, women found ways to navigate survival. Some converted to the religion of their captors, gaining new roles in households. Others bore children who might one day inherit wealth or status. While their circumstances were shaped by violence, their resilience left marks on the fabric of societies, blending cultures and bloodlines across regions. The legacy of these forced unions is still visible in the genetic and cultural landscapes of Europe today. We often ask whether people of the past saw this as cruel or normal. The answer lies in the complexity of medieval thought. While violence against women was accepted, it was not universally applauded. Certain church leaders condemned rape during war, and some law codes imposed severe punishments on rapists. Yet these punishments were rarely enforced with consistency, and powerful men frequently escaped consequences. What this reveals is a world in which ideals of morality coexisted uneasily with brutal realities, where women's suffering was acknowledged but often dismissed as unavoidable. In exploring these contradictions, we glimpse the heart of medieval patriarchy, a system that both idolized and degraded women, that placed them on pedestals as symbols of purity, while simultaneously using their bodies as tools of dominance. It is this paradox that makes the study of sexual violence and captivity in the Middle Ages so unsettling and so necessary. For it forces us to confront the ways in which power shapes sexuality, and how often the voices of the vulnerable are lost in the shadow of history. The experiences of noble women deserve special attention, for while they lived in castles and courts rather than fields and villages, their fate was hardly free from the violence of their age. Indeed, in many ways, they were even more vulnerable, because their marriages and bodies were directly tied to the fortunes of kingdoms. When a castle fell, the fate of its lady was sealed along with its garrison. Chroniclers tell of queens and duchesses carried off into forced unions, their captivity serving as a political tool. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, experienced imprisonment at the hands of her own husband, King Henry II of England. While she was not raped in the literal sense, her political captivity illustrates the broader principle that women's lives, no matter their rank, could be reshaped by male dominance in ways that blurred into violence. For lesser noblewomen, the dangers were even starker. During the 100 Years' War, roaming armies often besieged castles, taking noblewomen hostage for ransom or as bargaining chips. In some cases, they were spared physical violation because their ransom value was higher intact. In others, they were humiliated precisely to weaken their family's standing. The violation of a noblewoman could ripple across politics, tainting lineages and undermining claims to legitimacy. This was why marriages, even forced ones, were sometimes used to mask acts of violence, turning assault into a socially acceptable union. Peasant women, in contrast, rarely had even this fragile protection. Their bodies were less politically significant, and thus their violation left fewer traces in the chronicles. Yet archaeological and folkloric evidence suggests that their suffering was widespread. Folk tales often contain echoes of abduction, forced marriage, and captivity, cloaked in symbolism. The story of a maiden carried off by a monster or knight may have been more than fantasy. It may have been a cultural memory of the dangers women faced. Religion, once again, shaped how these events were interpreted. Virgin martyrs like Saint Agnes or Saint Lucy became symbols of resistance, young women who supposedly chose death over dishonor. Their stories inspired generations, but also reinforced the idea that a woman's worth lay in her purity, not in her survival. For ordinary women, this was a cruel standard to live up to. To survive rape was to be seen as tainted. To resist was to risk death. Either way, the woman was judged not by her courage or humanity, but by the condition of her body. Monastic communities offered some refuge, though not always as safe as we might imagine. Convents were vulnerable to attack, and there are records of nuns being raped during raids. Yet the cloister did provide women with a measure of control over their lives, including authority within their own communities. Some abbesses wielded significant power, managing lands and even negotiating with kings. Still, the specter of sexual violence haunted even these sacred spaces, a reminder that no woman was truly safe in a world where war and patriarchy reigned. The psychology of captivity also shaped women's fates. To be held against one's will, forced into submission, was not only a physical ordeal but a profound mental one. Captors often used sexual violence to break resistance, to humiliate captives, or to assert their power in ways that transcended the individual act. For the woman, survival often required a complex negotiation, compliance to avoid further harm, silence to preserve some fragment of dignity, or adaptation to life in captivity. These survival strategies, while pragmatic, were later judged by communities as dishonorable or sinful. Women who bore children in captivity were stigmatized, their offspring often marginalized, yet these same children could also inherit and continue lines, embedding the consequences of violence into the very structure of society. As we examine these lives, we see not only suffering but endurance. Women endured, adapted, and in some cases, wielded the limited tools available to them to secure survival. Their stories, though often unrecorded, remain embedded in the cultural fabric of medieval Europe, whispered through tales, legal records, and the silences of history. By the late Middle Ages, the consequences of centuries of violence and captivity had left deep scars on society. Law codes began to reflect growing anxieties about sexual violence, not necessarily out of concern for women, but because of the destabilizing effects it had on social order. Rape could spark feuds between families, dishonor entire lineages, and complicate inheritances. Thus, authorities sometimes cracked down, imposing harsher penalties, though enforcement remained inconsistent. The very fact that these laws proliferated suggests that sexual violence was widespread enough to demand attention, even if justice was rare. At the same time, literature and art reveal shifting perceptions. Courtly love poetry idealized women as distant objects of worship, while simultaneously normalizing the idea of pursuit and conquest. The metaphor of a knight storming a lady's heart often mirrored the literal storming of castles, and the taking of women as spoils. The line between romance and violence blurred, reflecting and reinforcing cultural acceptance of coercion. Plays and ballads sometimes mocked women's resistance, framing it as part of the game of love. To modernize, this is deeply unsettling, yet it underscores how normalized the intertwining of sex and force had become. Captivity continued to play a role in larger geopolitical struggles. During the Ottoman incursions into Europe, entire communities were taken, with women and children carried off into slavery in Istanbul or beyond. The trauma of these raids left lasting marks on European memory, shaping fears and fueling propaganda. In Christian narratives, the captive woman became a symbol of Christendom itself, violated by the infidel. Yet this metaphorical use of women's suffering often erased the real voices of those who lived through it. Their lives became symbols, their pain repurposed for political ends. But history is not only about oppression, it is also about resilience. Women did not vanish into silence. Some used captivity as an opportunity to negotiate new identities, adapting to foreign cultures, even rising to influence in their captors' courts. Others preserved their experiences in letters, poems, or testimonies, leaving fragments for us to piece together centuries later. These fragments remind us that while sexual violence and captivity were pervasive, they did not entirely erase agency. Survival itself was a form of resistance, and the legacies of these women, though shaped by violence, continue to echo. Reflecting on this history, we are left with difficult questions. How do we honor the memory of women whose suffering was normalized? How do we tell their stories without reducing them to victims alone? And what does this history teach us about the enduring connections between sex, power, and violence? The answers are not simple, but they matter, for the echoes of medieval captivity still shape the modern world, in cultural myths, in gender norms, and in the lingering scars of historical violence. As we close this journey through the fate of women in medieval Europe, we are reminded that history is not always a tale of knights and castles, of romance and honor. Beneath the surface lies a darker story, one that forces us to confront the cruelty and resilience of humanity. Women's bodies were battlegrounds, their lives shaped by forces beyond their control, yet their endurance shaped the very fabric of European society. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of sexual violence and captivity in the Middle Ages. Which fact surprised you the most? Was it the legal codes that treated rape as a crime against property? The haunting reality of noble women taken as political prizes, or the hidden history of medieval slavery? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's discuss how history continues to echo in the present. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories about the hidden history of sex and sexuality, where we uncover the truths that textbooks often leave untold.